The world listened, but didn't hear. The world listened, but it did not act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now.
A blustering new UN report paints a stark picture of global climate change. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. A code red for humanity. That's how UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres describes a devastating landmark review into climate change. For the first time, the report states unequivocally that human activity is changing the planet in unprecedented and irreversible ways. Global scientists are calling for the immediate and sweeping reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We begin with this report from Toni Waterman in Brussels.
Crackling wildfires, raging rivers, devastating storms. Global scientists warning that climate change and its devastating effects are on the verge of getting out of control. In the coming decades, temperatures will be hotter, extreme events more frequent and severe.
Climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster.
The new landmark report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that unless there is immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would be beyond reach. Even under a best-case scenario, scientists say that threshold will likely be crossed in the next 2 decades, earlier than some past predictions. No region on the planet is spared, and the blame, for the first time, being put squarely on humans, who have failed to curb their reliance on fossil fuels despite decades of warnings from scientists.
It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe.
The world's oceans, ice sheets, and sea levels will suffer the worst fate. The report saying changes already underway will be irreversible for thousands of years, as heat trapped deep in the oceans will continue to cause melting.
We are damaging the climate in such a way for the next generations that this will certainly make the socioeconomic difficulties in the future much worse than in our generation.
Despite the dire warnings, the report does offer small glimmers of hope. The worst outcomes can still be avoided if the planet can bring emissions to zero in the coming decades and reverse deforestation. The IPCC report comes just 3 months before global leaders meet in Scotland for COP26 climate negotiations. They are facing increased pressure to show up not only with more ambitious climate goals, but also with specific strategies on how to reach those goals. Even with their best efforts, though, the planet is changing, although the cost of inaction will be much higher. Toni Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. John Englander is an oceanographer, climate analyst, and author. His latest book is Moving to Higher Ground: Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. Changhua Wu is Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. Also with us is Sweta Chakraborty. She's the President of U.S. Operations for We Don't Have Time. That's the social network that launched environmental activist Greta Thunberg. And joining us from Atlanta is Kim Cobb. She's an award-winning climate scientist at Georgia Tech and a leading author of the UN Panels Report. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Kim Cobb, let me start with you. As I said, you were one of the lead authors of this report, and you have been talking about it to the media. In one interview, you say we've gone from, quote, virtually certain humans cause climate change to now being unequivocal. You also say in one of the key passages of the report that we are, quote, we're out of time. So question is, what's changed?
Well, we've known that humans are warming the planet for decades now, and that's not really new. This report, of course, establishing that beyond a shadow of a doubt with so many different indicators of key variables of the climate system leaping out of the background noise at this point in time. But obviously, this report goes much further in adding a new layer and lines of evidence to link extreme climate and weather events to ongoing warming, and clearly outlining the choices that we make in the next decades and the consequences for climate changes mid-century and beyond.
Kim, the report also says that rising seas, melting ice caps, and other effects of a warming planet may be, it says here, irreversible for centuries. Talk to us about the impact, what that means. What will it mean for us as humans and for the planet, of course?
Well, I have to admit that this is work that has been coming out over the last decade with increasing clarity. And when I first kind of stopped and realized that every year for the next millennium or more, we would be seeing an incremental increase in global sea level, it's quite shocking to contemplate, honestly. But the key point about this report is that these lower emissions trajectories that were released in this report are associated with keeping warming to a minimum this century. That would be 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 1 degree Celsius, and that those sea level rise futures stabilize at lower sea levels and they get there slower. And those are both key parameters to consider when we think about the sea level future for our planet. Of course, keeping it to a minimum, even though we will be facing centuries of ongoing sea level rise, is really what we're up against right now. And that's what is clearly articulated in the study of these scenarios in the report.
Sweta Chakraborty, you've done a lot of work on the impact that climate change has on humans, on activity on the planet here, and what it does to the planet as well. What were your main takeaways from the report?
What was most exciting about this report is that the scientists did not hedge on the relationship between human activity and climate change. And historically, these reports have really underestimated what we are going to be facing. And so the fact that this report so directly stated the reality of what is coming, and also the fact that humans unequivocally contributed to the warming of the planet, but also that we can course correct. It's in our power to be able to take this time and to take advantage of this window that we have to really be able to offset some of those worst case scenarios that we wouldn't want to wish on our worst enemies. So that was, to me, the best takeaway coming out of this report, is the urgency of what we need to do now in terms of global collective action.
Sweta, one other thing that's in the report, and this is the whole question of methane gases. The data shows that methane in the atmosphere is skyrocketing, and methane contains 80 times the planet-warming power of carbon dioxide. So how does methane in the first place get into the atmosphere, and how do we stop that?
So methane gas is much more intense of a greenhouse gas than carbon, but it also stays in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time. So we can actually make some real headway if we focus in on methane and removing methane from pollutants like oil and gas energy emissions. That's really where this comes from primarily, as well as from sectors like food and agriculture. So as we think about overhauling these sectors and getting them to clean energy primarily, then we can reduce methane, which will have a really positive impact on the amount of greenhouse gases and the speed to which the atmosphere is warming.
Right, so the culprit here again, Sweta, is fossil fuels.
Absolutely. That's what we're seeing.
Right. Changhua, the report says that nearly every region in the world will be affected by climate change. We heard that in our report at the beginning as well. And we are already seeing extreme weather conditions in many parts of the world. How are these extreme weather conditions actually linked to climate change?
I think the report offers contributes in many, many ways. One of the biggest contributions from this particular assessment report is the certainty, this climate science certainty. For a long while, actually, whenever we articulated about the climate change and the linkage with extreme weather events, we always have this sort of dotted lines, right? We try to avoid the direct linkage between the climate change and one specific extreme weather event. Now, with this report, we have a solid foundation to clearly state the direct linkage between the two. With that in place, I think there's going to be solid scientific foundation to really support or incentivize decision makers to make the decision to accelerate, carbon emission on one side, of course, resilience on the other side. And China happens to be one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. As said, of course, no country is spared. China, in particular, in this, in this case, China has roughly 30,000 kilometers more, actually, coastal lines. Just imagining the sea level rise, as the report articulated in the region, as well as actually its impact actually on the coastal regions, infrastructure and population. And China's coastal regions happens to be where nearly half of the population of the country reside, and also maybe 3/4 of the country's GDP are sort of born there as well. Just imagining the impact actually will be tremendous, and the country somehow at this moment has to figure out how to put all the specific actions best together under the context of the carbon neutrality goal before 2060 and really deliver that in collaboration with the global community.
Right, John Englander, Kim Cobb was talking to us a moment ago about rising sea levels. This is your area of expertise, of course, among other things. When we talk about rising sea levels, what are we talking about? Because to most people, if you tell them, look, the level's going to go up by 1 inch, they would not think that's very serious.
Yes, and we could probably tolerate an inch, but we're now talking about somewhere between 50 centimeters, a meter, 2 meters, and even possibly higher, depending on how warm the planet gets. We may not think that 50 centimeters, 1.5 feet of sea level would make a big difference, but in many cases, that would move the shoreline kilometers inland. If you think about low-lying countries, not just Miami in the United States, but of course China, as was mentioned, but Bangladesh, Vietnam, Pakistan, all very low-lying coastal countries, India, where not just tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people will be displaced by even a meter or two of sea level rise.
I was reading about something else, John, and that is the water in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, is constantly circulating a complex pattern that influences weather on several different continents. But there's now evidence that this ocean system is actually unstable. That comes from a new analysis which was published in the scientific journal Nature Climate Change. How does this work, and what kind of impact are we talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Anand. That was a major finding of the new IPCC report, was validation that what we think of as the Gulf Stream frequently, which is from the Gulf of Mexico up across North America's east coast, but it's part of a global conveyor belt, what they call the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. It's a complex conveyor belt, and it gets up to Greenland, and that's where the water goes back down deep, cold, and returns to the south. And the warming planet, the warming Atlantic Ocean more specifically, and the melting of ice on Greenland, entering huge quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean, is now been shown to be slowing that great Atlantic current, again, which we think of as the Gulf Stream. That takes warm heat energy from the southern Atlantic and up to not only Greenland, but to Europe. It's one of the warming factors that keeps Europe so temperate. So the impacts of a slowing, let's call it the Gulf Stream, or more technically the AMOC, is very profound. It's going to change weather patterns, agricultural patterns, and livability to an almost unimaginable degree as the decades pass.
Kim, of course, one of the questions that'll be asked right now, we have the report, it's been published. Will it lead to any kind of global action? That is something that the Executive Director of Greenpeace in the United Kingdom, John Servan, has been talking about. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
It's a bit like an alarm clock. You can keep switching the alarm clock off, but eventually, if you don't get out of bed and go to wherever you're meant to be going to, it will be too late. You won't get there in time. Scientists can produce reports, but scientists can't save the world. They can just tell us what is happening. This is absolutely down to governments. And there are only a few critical governments which are really important. You know, the rich countries agreed more than 10 years ago to put a pot of money together to help developing countries deal with climate change. 10 years later, they have still not got that money together. The trust from the developing countries in the rich world is collapsing as a result of that.
So, Kim, does John Servan have a point there? I mean, what can we do about this trust deficit that he talks about between rich and poor countries?
Well, certainly everybody has a lot on the line right here. And that's what this report really drives home. Again, no region is spared. Every region is reeling from multiple changes that are already underway, and now we know will get worse over the next 20 years until such time as we hopefully move towards those deep and sustained emissions reductions. And so what really has to happen is a collective awareness of that risk that's piling up for everybody, and move swiftly to enact the kinds of low emissions trajectories that this report helps us understand, gives us the best chance of meeting those most ambitious Paris Agreement lines, 1.5 degrees Celsius most particularly. So obviously the issue of climate justice is implicit in those comments. And the fact that the developing world will be bearing the majority of the climate damages of emissions that have been accumulated by activities in the developed world is absolutely something that I expect will be discussed during the next conference of the parties, but is obviously the kind of policy prescriptive information and conversations that the IPCC is careful to stay away from, but rather coming back to the bottom line. There's plenty of risk to go around here.
Kim, of course, a lot of this will come down to money. Do you expect that the report that's been published will perhaps ignite more spending on climate issues?
Well, I certainly hope that the world can make the kinds of deep investments that will be required to quickly transition our economies away from emissions-intensive fossil fuels towards lower carbon economies. But obviously, we also have to think about how we're going to keep communities safe across the world. And those are also critically important investments. And it oftentimes can be informed by the vast trove of science that just dropped yesterday in the form of this report, region by region analyses of what we already know is happening and what we expect to happen going forward. And so it can't just be about investments in lower carbon infrastructure and energy. It also has to be about ensuring that we keep communities safe using the best available science.
Sweta, of course, one of the things we've been talking about, the report tells us that it's now unequivocal that human activity causes climate change. This is what the chair of the UN panel had to say. Let's listen.
First, it tells us that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe. Second, it shows that climate change is affecting every region on our planet. And lastly, it explains that strong, rapid, sustained reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions would be required to limit global warming.
So, Sweta, let's look at the first part of what Hoo-Sung Lee had to say there. He says that it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, but that has in fact become a bit of a political issue. If we look just here in the United States, for instance, conservatives say that humans have nothing to do with it. It's just the normal behavior of the planet. It's something that's cyclical. Do you think the publication of this report will perhaps end that argument?
Well, the publication of this report is really cutting through partisan lines in that there is the majority of Americans still want to see clean energy be part of Biden's Build Back Better agenda. We need to see that passed here in the United States, regardless of where people fall on the political spectrum. Everybody wants to end pollution. Majority of Americans are sick of breathing in air that makes them more likely to face worse outcomes, especially if they have underlying conditions. So that is an issue that really brings together Americans, as well as national security issues that these climate change impacts will amplify as the planet continues to heat up. So there are ways to discuss the results that came out yesterday in this report that unites Americans, and we really need that to happen. We need to see Biden's climate agenda pass through Congress, because once we lead here at home and once we acknowledge the legacy of environmental racism domestically in the United States, then the U.S. is better positioned going into COP26 to demand that other countries also support the nationally determined contributions that they committed to back during the Paris Accords and see those through. We need to see blueprints from countries around the world to commit to reducing carbon emissions. That's the only way we're going to stave off those worst case scenarios and usher in a cleaner future.
Right, and Sweta, do you get the sense that there is a recognition among the political classes in this country that this is a serious crisis? I mean, we are all aware how deeply polarized the country is.
Absolutely, it is polarized, but I see the statistics increasing in even conservatives that there's an acknowledgement that climate change really needs to be a priority, a national security priority, a health priority, an environmental priority, and beyond. This climate change impacts every aspect of our decision-making daily, and those elected into power have to acknowledge that. And so we see majority of Americans increasingly demanding that policy like clean energy tax credits be put forward, and that's where hopefully we will see some policy progress before the end of this year.
Changhua, I want to look at the time issue that was mentioned in this report. The report says that we're out of time. What does that mean? I mean, suppose policies are implemented right now and vigorously implemented. Is there time to catch up?
I think there is. This is sort of this, even though the report overall, the tone is very dire, right? There is a dire future, not future today, actually, and tomorrow we're already in. But this particular slim of hope is that we still have a chance or window, actually, to take actions there in a timeline manner. A couple of dimensions to look at it. So this is next 2 decades, and so 1.5 degrees Celsius warming goal. Definitely, if we do not take immediate actions, we're going to definitely cross that. That's said very, very clearly by the scientists in this report. In the meantime, if you look at the solution part, and particularly around emission reductions there, we pretty much know where the problems are, right? We know the burning fossil fuels, a clear forest deforestation, as well as actually uploading the atmosphere with the greenhouse gases, not only carbon emissions, but also other greenhouse emissions like methane and nitrous oxide, among others there. So now we know where the root causes, and we know actually where the burning fossil fuels come from, and we also know where the alternatives. So from that context, actually, I think this is where the hope is. So we have the solutions pretty much, if not all of them, most of them. We know we have to decarbonize our energy, system. We have to, transform fundamentally, clean up our transportation system, our industrial system, and to enhance the agriculture, carbon sink, among others. So with all this adding up, we know that the hope is already on the table. If you look at all the commitments by in the Paris Agreement, yeah, even with all the commitments on the table now, there's carbon neutrality by mid of century. If we really deliver them, and that definitely will offer the hope. So the focus now, with the scientific foundation solid on the table, we just need to make sure all the commitments on the table, at least today, actually, we need to deliver them.
John, the report says that global heating above 1.5 degrees Celsius will be catastrophic for Pacific island nations. It could lead to the loss of entire countries due to rising sea levels. Take us through the science behind that.
Well, the amount of ice on Greenland and Antarctica, which is 98% of the ice on land, will determine how much sea level rises. And the warmer planet, those 2 great ice sheets are going to melt faster and faster. They're about 2 miles, 3 kilometers thick. It's a little hard to predict exactly how they'll melt, but we do know that for each degree Celsius of warming, that we see meters of sea level rise over the course of centuries. So we've gotten used to sea level being where it's been for about 6,000 years, all of recorded human history. We kind of assumed that was a standard sea level, but sea level moves up and down greatly. Mm-hmm. And the idea that now, with a warming world, already 1.2 degrees warmer, and potentially 2 or 3 degrees warmer, of course the ice is going to melt, the sea is going to rise, and it's going to push shorelines inland. And any small island is going to be at jeopardy, whether that be the Bahamas, whether that be the Pacific Islands, the Indian Ocean, or we really have to rethink the concept of a stable shoreline, and it should motivate us to take the steps recommended in this report to slow the warming as an emergency course of action, because sea level will determine the shoreline.
Kim, what are the changes that have taken place already that the report refers to as irreversible?
Well, thankfully, there are relatively few things that fall into that dire category, at least over geologic timescales, which is, as a geologist, I hold dear. One of those things that the report is really referring to is sea level rise. Quite specifically, the fact that the ice caps as they exist right now are already under too much warming for their size, and so they are melting, and they will continue to melt going forward. Some of the other things that we think of as very long-term adjustments in the Earth system that the report calls out would be things like ocean acidification. The fact that we have been, by dumping carbon dioxide into our atmosphere for decades now, that has been absorbed and transferred into increased acidity across the surface ocean, down to almost half of the ocean's depth. And so that, of course, will have profound implications for the structure and function of ecosystems in the ocean. But notably, given the circulation timescale of the ocean, that is also going to take quite a bit of time to reverse, even if we do drive emissions down aggressively this century. And of course, the other thing with that same kind of memory idea in mind, ocean warming itself has percolated down through the upper kilometers of the ocean, and that will also take time on the timescale of ocean mixing, which is 1,000 years to fully equilibrate with whatever stable climate we would like to achieve. So it's really where the memory holds in the ice caps as well as in the ocean that are some of these longer term changes that we know will unfold over centuries, not slower than that.
Right. Sweta, the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, she's been talking about the report. She says it contained no real big surprises. She said we can still avoid the worst consequences, but this has to be treated as a crisis right now. What do you think? Can the worst consequences be avoided?
Absolutely. And that's really the main takeaway from this report that we need to make sure is really spread wide, is that we caused this, but we can course correct. We can adapt to the reality of what we know is coming, and we can stave off those worst case scenarios by mitigating against carbon emissions and methane emissions and overall reducing the greenhouse gases eventually in time. So actually taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. There's technologies in the pipeline that could potentially do that, but we have the tools in our toolkit right now. What we need is the political will, and we can overcome this.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.